Hello and welcome everybody to our event this afternoon. My name is Alexander Kaye. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies here at Brandeis University. I'm going to introduce our panelists this afternoon for this wonderful event. But first, I want to give a couple of words of explanation as to why we are holding the event today on the Israeli media during wartime. The reason we're talking about the media today is really threefold. First of all, as a center that deals with Israeli society, history, and culture, we firmly believe in exploring all aspects of Israeli society. And just like with any country, the media is a primary way into understanding the way that people think. In Israel, just like with anywhere else, it's an extremely complex thing to understand the panoply of media outlets on television, social media, and print, the people that fund these outlets, the people that watch them and understand them. And we need an experienced guide to help us get into and understand the media ecosystem of Israel. And that's who we have with us today. But there's another reason as well, which is that in Israel, like in any country, there is what used to be called a public sphere. There are certain things that in any country, it's kind of assumed that people know certain things, that there are certain ideas people take for granted, certain images that everyone has in their minds. For people outside of Israel, it's not immediately clear what those things are. And if you want to understand Israel, you have to understand what those things are. And it's the media and understanding the Israeli media that helps us do that. To get to grips with these ideas, we need a guide. And that is who we've brought to you today. Our guide is Romy Neumark. Romy has had over 2 decades of experience in Israeli radio and television. Most recently, she was senior news anchor at Israeli Public Broadcasting Corporation, Kan. Currently, she is the Gerard Weinstock Visiting Lecturer and Fellow at Harvard University, where last year she was a Nieman Fellow and currently is teaching courses on Israeli media and cinema. In her classes, she interviews wide, diverse varieties of filmmakers and journalists. And she has a massive and extensive professional experience, incredibly trusted perspective in Israel and outside. She's also got a very particular perspective because she has all this experience inside Israel as an active journalist, but also having been in the United States for some time, has a certain amount of critical distance that can help us act as our guide of the Israeli media landscape. Together with my colleague, Dr. Shayna Weiss, the Senior Associate Director of the Schusterman Center, Romy and Shayna have put together this kind of marvelous 3-part series that will introduce us to the Israeli media landscape. I'm going to leave it to Romy and Shayna to say more about this 3-part series as they go forward. I'm going to turn it over the session now to Shayna and Romy, who are going to have a discussion about Romy's work and the way that they envision the Israeli media, to give you a basic overview of everything that's going on there. And then we're going to turn over to questions from the audience that we have with us today. I'm going to ask anybody that wants to issue questions during the session today to please put them in the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. And with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Weiss. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, Romy, so much for joining us today. And Romy, we already heard a little bit about your bio, but I was wondering if you would just tell us a bit more about maybe some of your own experience in Israeli media and so that the audience knows who we're talking about and why we asked you to do this.
Thank you, Shayna, and thank you, Alex, and thank you, everyone, who are tuning into our conversation. I started my career almost 23 years ago at the age of 18. I had my own very early, 5 a.m. early morning show at Galei Tzahal. It's the radio IDF. I was drafted to this unit after I finished my high school. And actually, since then, I'm in this landscape of the Israeli media. I worked for Ma'ariv and I worked for Walla in the website. And I also worked for Channel 10, which is now Channel 13 News. And I was one of the first journalist who joined the Israeli public broadcast after the huge overhaul in 2017. And I hosted my own nightly news show called Nightly News before I came here to Harvard almost a year and a half ago.
Okay. So Romy, before we, for those of us who are less familiar, I was wondering if you could sort of walk us through the basic Israeli media landscape. And obviously this is a huge question and we're not going to go into enough detail, but at least just thinking about, let's say, television news. What are the big players? Who are the stations or sort of people that we should know about?
I think the first step should be talking about the public outlets and the commercial outlets. So I'll mention the radio as well. Galei Tzahal is an army unit, actually, is one of the most popular radio stations. And in the same way, I can talk about Reshet Bet and the other Kan, which is the public broadcast radio stations that are extremely popular and also very trustworthy in the Israeli eyes. If we talk about television, it's also worth mentioning that since October 7th, most of the television channels are doing news almost 24/7. So if beforehand, I don't know, they would start around the afternoon to show only news, and 8 p.m. is the main edition. Now they start at 7 a.m. sometimes, and this is what they show the Israeli public through all those hours until after midnight. We're talking about three main public newsrooms or news companies. I started with the public, so Kan has Kan 11, Kan 11, and they show news, and there's a Channel 12, which is the most popular. They have the best rating, more than 3 times the others. Yonit Levy is one of the well-known hosts. There's Channel 13 that also had a very popular 8 p.m. main edition primetime show. This used to be Channel 10. They had a lot of conflicts with Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Channel 10 was actually closed and started again as Channel 13, and the news company actually moved when the channel changed the numbers, and they changed owners through the years. And there is a Channel 14 that just lately, I would say, started to broadcast news. It started as a more Jewish tradition channel, and maybe some of you know it as Channel 20. And now is also a lot about news, Channel 14. Maybe the American equivalent would be Fox News. They're supportive of the Likud party. And this is like the landscape of the television. We can also mention Yediot Acharonot as one of the most popular and also known newspapers, but the most popular is Israel Hayom, which is actually a free newspaper. And Haaretz, that a lot of you, I guess, know his English edition, is another, it's like in the other side of the scala that is more, I would say, liberal, left-wing.
Okay, right. And of course, maybe we'll talk about this more in the Q&A or if there are questions, but there's, of course, just as there is in America or other contexts, citizen journalists, social networks, all that sort of thing obviously plays a huge role as
There
well.
is independent journalism, if this is what you meant. It's not as popular as the mainstream I mentioned, but thank you for asking, because I do want to mention the Orthodox Jews outlets that are sometimes, most of the time, very different. The way they cover the same stories, they have their own way of telling a story. And there's also Arab Palestinians outlets in the Arabic language that also are radio station, newspapers, websites. Even Khan has their own outlet for Arabic. And we can also talk about the digital, but maybe you have more questions.
Yeah, so let's send in questions if you have about the digital, but it's important to keep in mind. So, we talked a bit about the different stations and sort of who they are. I was wondering if you could talk about sort of who are Israeli journalists. Like, are they representative of Israel's diversity? Where do they come from? Sort of what have you noticed?
Well, this is a huge question, and of course, it's very difficult to answer. But if I'm trying to give some of my knowledge or to the American public, there's one thing that worth mentioning is that Galei Tzahal, where I was trained as a soldier, is like a pipeline to a lot of the senior positions of the press and the media in Israel. Almost every year, there are between 20 and 30 soldiers that are being trained in their military mandatory service to be journalists. And they do it during their service, of course. And when they finish it, they are hired in a lot of the outlets that I just mentioned. So if we look at the structure and the managerial positions of a lot of the journalists who, get into high position in a young age, most of the time you'll see the Galei Tzahal people there. It's a very, very strong network. If they are representing the Israeli society, it's a great question. I think that, as I mentioned, the Orthodox Jews are not in the same representation. Also, of course, Arabs, Palestinians do not have the same. We are talking about 21% of the public in Israel. You don't see 21% of the journalists from those societies. And we can also talk about women in this field. There's a change that happens, I would say, in the last 20 years, that you see much more women journalists. And if you will open the newscasts of the 8 p.m. that I mentioned, they are all being hosted usually by women journalists who are extremely talented. But it's only in the last few years that you can see in those positions of economic correspondent or defense, military, army reporters, you see more and more women. It was traditionally only a men's club. But it's changing right now. From within the newsroom, I can say that there's a lack of women in managerial positions for many reasons that you probably know from other countries. But this is also something that starts to change, but all of the managers of the main TV outlets are men today.
Yeah. And then, sort of my next question is sort of how Israelis sort of consume media in general, right? Like, at least I had this impression that like Israelis are obsessed with news and like watch news all the time, and much more than Americans who we assume, or let's say North Americans or in the United States, we assume are like disconnected and are not as involved, Is that true? Right? Are Israelis more sort of news obsessed than Americans? Are there age differences? What do we know about that?
There are age differences for sure. The younger audience get their news or updates from social media. We don't see them in the reports of watching TV, especially not in this traditional hour of 8 p.m. It's not something that people would wait to hear what happened. But still, I think the war now is an interesting angle because the rating, if we're talking about television, is definitely higher than before October 7th, but still those are more old, it's older audience. And if we're talking about trends before October 7th, it was very clear that the rates are going down, that even the olders are not watching it as they were watching the 8 p.m. news in the past. You know, Israelis have those notifications in their phone. They are very connected to the news, and it's because we are in a state of emergency. You have to know what's happening. It's sometimes which roads are closed because of some kind of an event, and sometimes it's, you know, save your life kind of thing of where should I be, what is danger for me now, what's not. And the involvement in the politics is I think, used to seem higher than if we're trying to compare it to the American public.
Right. So I have one more question before I want to start talking about sort of the events of the past couple of months. And that's something that, you know, is different. And that's about the military censor, right? So Israeli media exists or doesn't coexist, right, with a media censor. So for those of us who are less familiar, could you explain to us what that is, how that works in actuality, and sort of, right, and how that plays out?
Okay, so the Israeli censorship is part of the Israeli army, part of the IDF, that historically is to help the not just the Israeli people to protect himself in state of war or any other state of emergency. I would say like a simple censorship rule used to be that if there was a rocket from Gaza or wherever that fell in the Mediterranean Sea, we would never report it, knowing that this will help the people who were targeting this rocket to know how to work with their systems and next time to have a better result. So there's a lot of things like that, but sometimes there are dilemmas that are more complicated. For example, there was a very famous story a few years ago about a soldier who was working for the intelligence and was accused of telling some kind of a military secret about what he was doing technically during his service. And he was put in prison, and there he committed suicide, and he became prisoner X that we are not allowed to talk about at all. Because everything was so secret about what he was doing and the reason that he was in jail, actually. So it was an absurd because this story was revealed by members of the Knesset that were asking live in the Knesset, what about the story of prisoner X? While a lot of the reporters and all the newsrooms knew about this story, but couldn't say a word because of the censorship's rules. So this is something that happens technically every night from around 7 p.m. till when the main edition ends. There's someone from the censorship sitting in the newsroom and watching every news clip that is about the army. They would see that we're not showing specific parts of specific secret weapon that might, I don't know, somehow be endangering the soldiers and so on. And we see that the censorship now in the war is sometimes self-censorship, and I would love to talk about it if you want. And sometimes it's not quite about the military actions. For example, when newsroom decides not to show the clips of the hostages that are being sent from Hamas, because they're saying that they would have a psychological effect that the newsrooms, through the censorship, but not exactly, don't want to take responsibility on. So there's a lot of ways of censorship. This is something that is being discussed a lot in the Israeli media arena, but it's definitely not new.
Can you say something about maybe how Israeli journalists have used foreign media outlets to get around, for lack of a better term, the censor, or how that can work?
Definitely. So the Israeli outlets are under the censorship rule. I don't know right now about specific cases of people going to jail. I don't remember. I don't think so. There were cases like that, but there's a very famous story about, they call it Kav 300. There was a
Line 300, case 300.
Line 300. A case of a terror attack with terrorists that were actually were killed after the attack actually finished by the military personnel who were there. And Israeli journalists had pictures of them alive after the operation was ended, and they were killed afterwards. And the pictures from this story were not published in the Israeli media for a certain amount of time, but the story was revealed on another outlet that was international. And this is one of the, and then it took time, and this is a very important story in the Israeli media and Israeli law and the secret services. But the fact that the first time this story was told was in another outlet outside of Israel is because of the censorship rules. And I think it's not only Israeli journalists since then using our colleagues around the world to tell stories. It's also the Israeli politic figures who sometimes try to talk to another audience and another journalist to say things that are more sensitive to the Israeli, not just censorship, but also the public.
Right. So just to give one example, I mean, you and I spoke about this. There was a Naftali Bennett column in the Wall Street Journal a couple of months ago where he published details of a certain operation that was not approved at all, of course, by the military censor. He wanted to say certain things, so he went to the Wall Street Journal to do so. And that's just one example. There are many, many.
There are many.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I want us to start thinking about sort of what happened on October 7th and the role that the media played. So there's obviously, this is a huge conversation, but let's just start sort of with that day itself. And, you know, you and I have talked a lot about, and we've talked in this series about the sense that the state wasn't there, right? That there was no one knew what was going on. There was sort of a total lack of any sense of power or anything. And sort of how did the media respond in those first 24, 48, 72 hours? What could we see on television or in the radio or whatnot?
I'll divide my answer to two parts. First, the Israeli journalists and the Israeli newsroom are very trained to give a really quick and dynamic response to any emergency you can imagine. I remember myself sitting in newsroom, and in 5 minutes from sitting in my ordinary clothes, I will be in the studio running a breaking news broadcast of 3 hours. And it happens to me many, many times when, not just when a war broke, but sometimes terror attack or any other disasters. So in 6:30 a.m. in the morning of Saturday, October 7th, there were no one in the newsroom actually to respond, but they were still trained enough to give the cameras and the microphones to the military reporters and correspondent and the south part of Israel reporters to stand in front of the camera and just start talking about what's happening, because there was no one in the control room in this time. So it's kind of automatic response that was extremely quick. You can say that the television first report and the radio first reports was almost in the same time, and those are such a different levels of production, just to make you understand how trained we are in starting broadcasts like that. So every Israeli that opened the TV saw the alerts of the rockets on half of the screen. It's orange lines saying the names of the villages and the cities and the places that are being bombed now, and some kind of a reporter standing with a microphone in most of the time in front of his house or outside of his balcony, talking and explaining things that in this time no one really understand what's happening. And this was the first hour of, or maybe hour and a half of the broadcast everywhere, besides channel 14 that didn't start broadcasting until Saturday, Shabbat ended. And I was listening to those reporters telling the story of this morning for them, and they were reading what they were used to read, which is the military and the IDF spokesperson alerts. And in the same time, they were starting to get the messages from their friends, family, other colleagues saying something worse is happening, but they couldn't say what's happening because, and this might be part of the self-censorship and also real censorship, trying to understand, wait, if I will tell that right now I have family in a safe room in one of the kibbutzim in the Otef, in public television, in national television, maybe now I'll make them, I will risk their life by doing it. Should I do it or not? And it took, I don't know exactly to tell you how many minutes to understand that this is another story that even the military is not equipped to give you the answers of what's happening on ground. And those reporters are telling how they feel guilty till this day, and maybe for the rest of their lives, for the fact that they, in the first minute, couldn't help people they know that were in risk and didn't understand what's happening. But then the second stage of this morning is that the reporters and the editors and producer understood that there's another event happening, and they started to interview those families in the safe rooms, in the kibbutzim, in the Gaza envelope, and understanding from them, not from the army, what is actually happening. And the viewers who are watching the Israeli television, and even people who are not at risk and there was not terrorists around their houses, I think will stay traumatized for the rest of their life as well from hearing those people calling for help again and again and again and saying, we are waiting for soldiers, for someone to save us. We hear the terrorists outside of our safe rooms and no one is coming for hours and hours. And most of that day, October 7th, the television became the moderator in a way, trying to connect between the people and the army that was not functioning. And this is how most Israelis who watch TV would remember that day, that we are calling them again and again, and they're not coming. And there are fascinating stories, really, a lot of heroes that, you know, the story of Lucy Arish, one of the journalists of Channel 13, who got messages from people about families who are stuck in their safe room and are not able to get out and need a rescue. And she personally was talking to her husband that went to the south with a group of people from that used to be in their same unit in the army, to start to save those people without the state actually involved. So the media had an enormous, very important, almost unbelievable role in October 7th. This is how it started. People remember Danny Kushmaro from Channel 12 being almost the protector and almost a father, or even another figures that were used in the media to try to explain, to describe how he handled it as the main host of during this day, talking to the people, trying to call help live. And when it starts like that, you can still see the effect on how the Israeli media continue to cover this story as part of the story. Like if the military was not functioning, we were functioning, and we have the responsibility, you know? So we've seen a lot of wars and a lot of military operation, how the lines are united in a way, and how journalists see themselves first of Israelis and patriots, and then in their professional role. But what happened in October 7th is that they were actually on the field trying to save people. It affects us till now.
Of course. Yeah. So I wanted to, shift and think about, and we're going to talk a lot about this, especially in the next session, of what it means to do reporting sort of since the war has started, but of two topics, and they're obviously related. And the two big things are, of course, anything involving the hostages and sort of the war on the ground in Gaza. So why don't we start with the hostages? We mentioned it already. Sensitivities of reporting, concerns of reporting, how has that played out, and what are some of the things you've noticed with reporting around the hostages, both the hostages still in captivity and also the ones that have returned?
There are amazing, really very high quality magazine stories about the hostages and their families. And it seems like the media, in my eyes, were trying to bring them home. You can see the yellow ribbon, and you can see this necklace in a lot of people. But I was looking today on one of the data boards, like the dashboards in Israeli websites, counting the numbers of hostages that are still held in Hamas captivities. And they also count the people that we know that are dead already. I think that the numbers that are being shown all the time, over and over again, and I agree that those numbers should be in the head of the news and the headlights, are numbers that includes people who are already dead, unfortunately. So it shows you that I think most of the media is very supportive of in bringing them back. But I think there's something that is not talked about here when we translate it to English. That those families of the hostages are being organized almost from day one, I believe, by an organization that helped them with not just the PR, with many aspects of life. And you know, my heart, I'm sure your heart, and a lot of our viewers' heart is with them all the time, and we cannot imagine how horrible their life is right now. And I'm sure they need all the help and the community of people with them, and organizing the protest, organizing their huge tent they have in Tel Aviv, but they're also doing the PR. And I heard from a lot of my colleagues that sometimes there are personal interests in this way of, would you give me this released hostage for a first interview? Sometimes there are channels that are not part of this. They are bargaining in a way with the stories of the hostages. I'm trying not to judge it, thinking we all understand why there are PR organizations in the world, and how and we're not innocent about how to do a campaign. Sometimes it looks bad, but maybe those are the rules of the campaign. But in the same time, it happens with life of families and hostages that are in the worst condition we can imagine. And I've heard that there are part of them were restricted from talking with certain journalists or in certain outlets because of other reasons that are not about would they be released or not, or things like that. So this is also an element that is important to know.
Right. And of course, and there's also not everyone, but some of the hostages who have returned, especially the teenagers, are that now have their own social media. Like I had, just the thing, like I had one of the hostages, like a Instagram story of her showed up on my suggested feed, and that was another sort of surreal experience, right? That we're getting used to. The other thing I want to mention, of course, is the war on the ground in Gaza. One of the big critiques you hear is that the human suffering, the sort of destruction on the ground in Gaza is not shown on Israeli television. It's not discussed, it's not covered, it's talked about. Do you agree with that, assessment? Why or why not? Can you give us a sort of sense of what sort of the average Israeli viewer knows about the ground operations happening in Gaza?
So the Israeli viewer is involved with what's happening in Gaza because he probably has a relative or a friend who was there, and but I would say that the Israeli media coverage is from the angle of the fighters on the ground, not from humanitarian or more Palestinian focused angle. And the reason for that, again, what I've heard from my colleagues is the trauma of being an Israeli, being in Israel and being Israeli in October 7th is something that has changed the way they think about their role as journalists.
Mm-hmm.
They think that their audience are not capable to hold two point of views, especially when we're talking about commercial outlets and commercial media. Like, okay, we need to tell the story from our point of view, and this is where the other side suffering has less. They have a less ability to understand what even happening on the other side. It takes me time to answer it because I think words that are not part of my professional vocabulary like revenge might be involved in the way people make decisions about it. Is it justified or not? It feels better to them just not to think about it and not to show it, so they won't have to talk about this meaningful suffering to human beings. But I can say from my own experience, because it's very hard to answer this question not being in newsroom in Israel now, and there are things that are happening that I just don't hear those. I'm not in the control room when they decide not to show it. Yes, but I can say that in the 20 years that I've been working in newsroom in Israel, saying words in Hebrew like kibush, occupation, when you say that word, immediately just using this word would put you in one side of the political map.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you don't want to be considered as left or right. So you just find another word to say it that will not mark a circle under your head, around your head, saying, okay, so she has left opinions, then she can't talk about those issues without her opinion.
Right.
So the Israeli media is not using the words kibush, occupation, for many years now.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about the conflict, about managing the conflict. We will talk about the territories, shtachim, but we won't say occupied territories, even in the mainstream media, because it immediately says, okay, so you're actually more pro-Palestinians or something else. So this is a trend that started many years ago, and I'm afraid that not showing the suffering in Gaza is part of it as well.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Alex, to come in and with some of the questions, which please continue to send in your questions as we discuss, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Shayna, and thanks, Romy, for the remarkable conversation so far. A number of comments from the audience have just been basically thanking you for being so forthright and honest and professionally just sort of expressing from the depths of your experience these very difficult matters. I'm going to do something which is essentially impossible now. We've had loads and loads of questions come in, and I'm going to try and kind of group them into categories and ask sort of groups of questions, and we probably won't get to everything, but we'll do what we can in the time that we have. So we'll come back to questions about coverage of the war in just a second, but some questions came in at the earlier part of your conversation with Shayna about sort of the pipeline to journalism and the kinds of journalists that are operating in Israel. And I know this is something that you've actually dedicated a large part of your career to working on and to increasing the diversity of journalists working in Israel. There was in particular a question from somebody who's watching this broadcast from Morocco right now, who's watching right now, asking, is it possible to train in Arabic language journalism in Israel right now? Another question asked about whether there are pipelines to broadcast journalism in Israel that do not come only through the army, but through other avenues, maybe through academia or through other routes. I wonder if you'd like to talk about those questions.
Yes, those are great questions, and I'm happy to answer as much as I know. The story of Arabic-speaking journalists in the Israeli media is fascinating because, as we know, it's not just the language. There's a lot of cultural barriers, even structural barriers that are challenging the life of journalists who speak Hebrew. And I'm using this term because there are Druze and there are Palestinians, and there are many ways to talk about who are those journalists. So the majority of them, the Druze can serve the army, so there is a way to come to the IDF, but there are few of them. The others are not serving the army, so they kind of miss the opportunity of Galei Tzahal. I know there are several programs. Part of them are through academia. There's a story of one of the diplomatic correspondent of Cannes, Solomon Maswadeh, that studied Hebrew from beginning at Hadassah in Jerusalem. And he started at Cannes really a few years after he learned the language. And today he's very senior, and this is like a success story. But the academia, the journalism schools in Israel are not as powerful or mainstream as the Galei Tzahal. Still, although Galei Tzahal is not what it used to be, there are many changes over there. There was a change of how we see Galei Tzahal in the last few years, but still the academia is not the main pipeline for new journalists. And part of what I'm doing here is try to envision a new training to journalists that would be more diverse, because we didn't mention the Orthodox Jews that has, yes, true, also their own outlets and own newspapers and even telephone lines that are part of the news coverage in the Orthodox communities. But it's so different for them to cross the line and to work for secular outlets, for example. So I think this is, if we're talking about journalism and democracy, this is one of the most important tasks for us to defend democracy by actually diverse our outlets. And we start with training, and I'm there. I'm in this front, definitely.
Yes, you're actively working in that field.
I'm mentoring, and I hope we will bring news in this field soon. Yeah.
You're giving us 2 more sessions after this one, and I hope you'll talk more about that as our audience hears more from you in the next 2 sessions. You've worked for a public broadcaster, which means it's funded by the state. Now,
Right.
The public broadcasting is funded by the state, the army is funded by the state, the government is funded by the state, the court, everything's funded by the state. But of course, all of these branches of government have different perspectives and have different functions. You and I have talked about the fact that the public broadcaster has got the highest level of trust when people are asked in polls, who do you trust the most? The public broadcaster receives the highest level of trust among the public, but it also receives the lowest level in terms of what is watched by the public. So the fewest number of people watch it, but the most number of people trust it. It's very difficult to kind of understand what that means in practice. What can you, in your best understanding, in your best analysis, what do and especially, I grew up in England where we had the BBC, so maybe I have some sense of what it means. And to have a public broadcaster, people in the United States may have a different feeling for what that sort of means. Can you give us your best analysis of what it feels like to live in a country with a public broadcaster which is paid for by the state and yet is distinct from the state? What does that say about the level of public trust? Do people trust in it for their news? Do they go outside the state for their news sometimes, especially when the public broadcaster reports about the state itself? Does that make any difference to people's understanding of the level of trust in journalists paid for by the state?
Well, you asked a lot of questions, and there's a lot of details. Please tell me if I missed something.
I asked too many. You do with it what you pick and choose whatever you want to talk about.
I think there are 2 terms that are well known around the globe, especially in this time of populism, and one of them are polarization And the other one, and it's connected, is the echo chamber. If we're talking, we want to hear what we think. It might be a human character, we are looking for people who are similar to us, that have similar opinions. And this is how the social media algorithm is working to make us more engaged, right, to our phones and to their other devices. And in time of polarization, and United States is in similar status, and I can talk about what I see about the Israeli society. To trust or to be a trustworthy outlet is nice, but when you want to hear people like you would go to more extreme outlets. So we see the success of Channel 14 in the last year and during the war. People might say it's because they're doing interesting television, but the kind of circus or, fighting on screen is not quite what I call journalism. But people still see it as almost entertainment when they watch it. And I can say similar things about Channel 12 that might look from different angles from the other side of the same spectrum, that are doing a lot of entertainment and not actually news. And there are hours and hours of panels in the studios trying to be balanced, but actually see people fight and not bring facts and do not bring, more deep coverage of what's happening outside of the studio. So this is a trend that we see all around the world. It's not just about how we see the Israeli media, in my opinion. So I choose only part of it, but please, if you want me to talk about other parts of your question, just remind me what they were.
No, I think you're exactly right. The phenomena that we're talking about here are certainly global phenomena. They have local flavor, but they're definitely global phenomena for sure. I'm gonna ask you just sort of move into the last, I suppose, category of questions. We may have time to ask a couple of questions in this category, but this I suppose comes back to the war now. I think this is a bit unfair to ask you these questions, but I'm going to ask you, and you can choose to pass if you like, because people are interested to know what you think about American media coverage of what is happening right now in Israel and Gaza. And I say it's unfair because, you're not an expert on the American media, and maybe, I don't know if you want to talk about the work of your American colleagues or not, but I'm putting the question to you, and if you'd like to talk about that, I know that people would be interested to hear your perspective on it.
So you're right. I'm not an expert, and I don't feel very comfortable to, of course, not to grade my colleagues. And I do, and I read a lot of articles, especially research articles, and television and print and digital in the international media. I can mention the New York Times, but there are others that were dealing with topics and events that the Israeli media was a bit slow about researching them. The events of what exactly happened in October 7th, for example. Part of it is the censorship, what Shayna and I was mentioning a few minutes ago. Part of them may be the trauma of the journalists in Israel not actually doing the work of, understanding what happened in the first minutes or even the night before. But things are starting to balance, I think, in the last few weeks, that the investigators in Israel are doing really, really good job trying to explain those complicated issues that are army military coverage in a way that the international media was better in the first month, for sure.
Mhm.
And if you are, or the audience were asking about anti-Semitism in the world coverage and so on, I think this is something that we should observe and check, but without talking about specific articles. I feel I can't criticize it, just talking generally about if there's a sentiment that is more anti-Israeli from the beginning without talking about the facts. With that saying, I know that Israel deserves a lot of the criticism that she got from around the world, and this is something that you might read it in Haaretz, but not really in other outlets, comparing to what you can read in English. And I would say that Hebrew, the language, is also a barrier for a lot of the Israelis. I mean, a lot of the Israelis speak English, even if it's not their first language, like in my case. But if we want to know what's happened, we won't open the New York Times or the Washington Post. We will still have a lot of loyalty, I would say, to the local outlets. And you can see, we're talking about it too earlier, that the politic figures who wants to talk to the international media are doing it for a reason, and they usually will talk about things that the Israeli public are harder to digest, I would say. There are different examples of that.
So I think that's the best possible point to bring our session to a close, which is, as you rightly point out, the language barrier, even for people that speak the other language extremely well, there's still an impulse of people to go to their first language first. And for people that have an interest in really understanding what is going on in another place, we all need to sort of encourage ourselves to the extent that is possible to go and listen to, speak to people or media or whatever it is that's actually being produced in that place. That's really the only way of getting to grips with what's going on over there. And it's really the reason that we are so glad that we've been able to bring you, Romy, to an audience, not just here in the United States, but actually globally, who are tuning in today and will be able to see this after the fact on our YouTube channel. The audience, so thank you so much for doing this today. And our audience will definitely be very glad to hear that there'll be 2 more opportunities, at least, to hear from Romy here at the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis. In 2 weeks on March the 11th, and then 2 weeks after that on Monday, March the 25th, both of them at 1 p.m. There'll be 2 further sessions, each of them led by Romy and designed by Romy and Dr. Shayna Weiss. The one on March 11th will be about investigative journalism and the challenges of investigative journalism during wartime in Israel. The one on March the 25th will be called When Are We Allowed to Laugh Again?, which will be about satire and humor, which is, of course, a very serious topic, actually, and a topic that gives a lot of insight into Israeli culture and society. And that will be on Monday, March the 25th. Romy Neumark, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Have a very good day, everybody.
Thank you very much.